good. In the meantime?
In the meantime, the war had started. We had tried to get my grandmother out, but then the war had started and we couldn't do that anymore. And she ended up in Theresienstadt, Terezin in Czechoslovakia, which was one of the camps, but it was not an extermination camp. She ended up there with her youngest daughter and her husband. The camp was an unusual camp. It was kept there, and it was the only camp that was ever open to the Swedish Red Cross, with the idea to show them that things weren't really as bad as they were said to be. The camp was nicely cleaned up and such for their visit, and after that it went back to normal. And when people were supposed to be killed, they were shipped off to Auschwitz. My dad and the youngest daughter and her husband were shipped out just a few weeks before the Russians freed the camp. My grandmother survived. And after the war, she came back to the United States to stay with us. After she died sometime later, I found out that she had written a short story of her life in the camp. And I got a hold of that, and I translated it for my children, and so that they could know what had happened. And they reacted, of course, when they found out that this happened to her grandmother. And one of the points I usually make when I talk to classes was that when you talk about 6 million people, that's a very large number. It's very difficult to try to relate to that. But when you find out that it happened to one person, like her or like me, that makes an impression that they can relate to. And my children responded that way just like anybody else. We got settled down in the United States very nicely. As a matter of fact, some couple of years later, when we had pretty well settled in, my dad asked the man that had brought us over, he said, we owe our lives to you. What can we do to repay you? And his answer was, you can't repay me because I have everything I need. But if anybody ever asks you to help them, remember what I did and do the same. My dad didn't have to be told that. Well, that pretty well finishes the story up to the time we arrived in the United States. If you have any questions, I'll try to answer them.
I have a few questions. I was wondering if you could talk, just for a little bit, about being a kid, playing with your brother.
Well, yes, but
I understand it was a difficult time period because of what was happening. But
at that time, just growing up, I had a number of Jewish friends and some non-Jewish friends. The non-Jewish friends sort of dropped off. I still had some Jewish friends, but there were few. And then, of course, as I said, when I finally got to the higher school, I was the only one. And from that time, there were no friends at all.
Did you have any hobbies when you were a kid?
Oh, just the usual, playing games. Soccer was the big one, of course, in Europe. But that was about it.
Okay. I've a couple more questions.
Sure.
Do you remember the names of the non-Jewish family that hid your father originally, as well as the name of the man who brought you guys over?
The name of the man that brought us over was Rakusin. I don't often remember the other name. It'll come back to me. But one other thing maybe to mention is both my brother and I ended up serving in the U.S. Army during World War II. And as a matter of fact, both of us were naturalized while we were in the Army. I was working at that time at at Fort Dix, and the time came to be naturalized. And Fort Dix at that time was manned, except for army people, by German and Italian prisoners of war. They did all the non-army things. So it ended up that the man that took the picture for my naturalization papers was a German prisoner of war, and I thought that was poetic justice.
When you were growing up, do you remember any specific, other than the violence that occurred in November of 1938, do you remember any specific acts of violence that took place?
Well, of course, very early in
Hold on.
some noise outside. Very early in the Nazi regime, there was burning of books, of any books that by Jewish authors or any books with Jewish themes on them. There was an attempt to boycott all Jewish stores, which didn't really work. Things like that we remember. And of course, later on, there were a number of things that were applied to all the Jewish people. They couldn't travel. They couldn't go to very many places. As I said, I think earlier, Jewish doctors could only work with Jewish patients, etc. So,
do you remember any specific pieces of propaganda, radio broadcasts, posters,